Can you clap once?
I'm Khagesh. I teach law, I practice law, and I write about law. That's the brief introduction. I attended law school in Delhi. I practiced law for about 4 years, 1 year in Delhi, and rest of the time in Chandigarh. After that, I studied in Columbia, obtained my LLM, and I recently, last year, finished my doctoral work from Indiana University. I wasn't very interested in legalization of cannabis or why it is illegal. In my practice, also generally, I did not come across much NDPS work. But in 2019, when I started my doctoral work in Bloomington in Indiana, I had some free time between my coursework was about to begin, and I had, of course, I was familiar with the fact that cannabis is legal in many states, but Indiana is not one of those states where it's still illegal there. But I was able to uncover a lot of literature, and I like reading in the library. One particular book, which the title of which I don't recall right now, but there was one particular book in the library that really caught my attention, caught my fascination, and I studied a lot. And out of that book, I learned that cannabis actually, at that point of time, I thought it was only for recreational purposes like alcohol. But turns out that cannabis could actually be used for much more than recreational purposes. And the book narrated a whole instance of a whole set of instances where it could be used for medical purposes. And that's what initially got me interested in this work. And after that, because my PhD work was in the area of criminal law generally, I decided that I could examine this one particular angle that brought in the NDPS Act work. So that's the initial exposure, and later on, as I read more about it, and as is the thing with academics, the more we read about something, the more we want to write about it, and that ultimately led in all that 2.5 years of research led in the writing of this book. And this book later resulted in a course that I'm teaching now, and hopefully more work will be done. But the initial interest was when I knew firsthand, and when I could personally tell that my knowledge isn't some drawing room conversation. This knowledge was based on uh, uh, citations and authorities in the book that referred to uh, journal articles published in very reputed medical journals. So I knew that the author is very serious when they talk about it, and that's when I decided to take it seriously. When I realized that medicinal aspect exists, and I personally think that the medicinal aspect is far more bigger and important than the recreational use aspect.
Okay, so what's your favorite strain? So you make a case for legalization in cannabis indica.
I do. I make a case, and I make the case on three fronts. Cannabis decriminalization in India as an academic discipline. I think the academic discipline has been established now that we have academic books on the subject, we are teaching courses on the subject. So I think cannabis decriminalization studies as a discipline is established in India. Within that discipline, I think there can be two approaches to the subject. One approach is to go after the NDPS Act. There's nothing wrong with it as such, but I think that falls into the wider area of criminal law reform or NDPS Act reform as such, which I think is a very important topic, but not the topic that I'm interested in. The way I approach cannabis decriminalization studies in India is to focus only on cannabis and to effectively argue, one, that from a legal standpoint, it seems the case to include cannabis in the NDPS Act is extremely weak. As I've said in the book, and I'm willing to say that again, there seems to, to my legal mind, there is neither a cause nor a case to have cannabis covered by the NDPS Act. So immediately, broadly, take cannabis out. Immediately, small quantities possession decriminalization. The possession of a small quantity of cannabis, perhaps even an ounce or 2 ounces. 1 ounce is approximately 28 grams, if I recall correctly. So that's about 40-50 grams of cannabis we're talking about. if I give a historical reference to the IHDC Commission report, that's Indian Hemp Drugs Commission, in 1894 they gave the report. I discussed that in chapter 2 of the book. According to that report, 60 grams is the quantity that we may consider to decriminalize. I think the possession of a small quantity of cannabis clearly intended for personal consumption should be decriminalized in our country. And I think the best way to go about it is to bring about necessary amendments in the NDPS Act. So that's my first point from a legal standpoint. Second, I think from a policy standpoint, we should have a legislation in India quite like the Canadian model. But I think to begin with, we can follow the Dutch model. In the Dutch model, Netherlands, in India, people are very well familiar with the coffee shop model. I've spoken about that in my book also. And I've taught about this coffee shop model in quite detail in the course. I think coffee shop model is a good model for India because it tolerates cannabis without declaring it to be legal per se. It allows an industry, so to speak, to develop, which can then later on be addressed by a more comprehensive and more enabling legislation. So I think from a policy standpoint, we should think about creating a system whereby we can take cannabis and remove it from the system that exists today, the NDPS Act system, and then we can probably have a separate legislation that deals with it in a manner which is beneficial to our economy. That's second. And third, as a teacher of constitutional law and as a young scholar of constitutional law, I think it's very doubtful if the Parliament of India has the requisite constitutional competence to even criminalize possession and consumption and cultivation and trade in cannabis. Note, I'm not saying that the Parliament does not have the power to enact the NDPS Act. Parliament very, very clearly has the power to enact the NDPS Act. But what I am saying is that while the NDPS Act is enacted, whether or not cannabis can be put within the ambit of the NDPS Act, that is what is doubtful. And that is an argument I've presented in quite detail in the book. I'm yet to see a response being made to that argument, and critics that have engaged with that argument have said that it's a novel position, but it's a position that is nevertheless made out by the text and the history and the structure of our constitution. So when those three grounds are satisfied, I think in constitutional law scholarship the argument is said to be sound. So I think the common people, the masses, may take it that in academic discipline it has now been established on the basis of objective evidence that Parliament can criminalize everything, but it can't touch cannabis. Who can criminalize it? Well, my argument is that nobody can criminalize it. The state government has the power to impose duties of excise, which is a tax on manufacturing, on it. And this duty of excise, these duties were imposed on ganja, charas and bhang, all three. And there are a lot of legislations before 1985 that show this. All those legislations are saved by section 81 of the NDPS Act, which says that previous legislations at state level, if they will continue to be. So to summarize, my case is, legally speaking, we should decriminalize small quantities possession, and we can safely consider 2 to 5 ounces as small quantity. We should have commercial quantity of cannabis very clearly notified by a notification or by amending the NDPS Act itself, so that the amount remains universal or constant across all the states. You can't have 3 grams legal in Haryana and only 1 gram legal in Himachal and 0 grams legal in Punjab. That creates a bureaucratic criminal law justice administration nightmare. So we have to have it clear, we have to have it uniform. And secondly, from a policy perspective, we should think about having a separate law like the Canadians have, like Americans have in a lot of states. And lastly, a constitutional point, which I think the Supreme Court is the best arbiter of whether or not the Parliament actually has the competence to do this. These are my 3 key points that I presented in the book.
Do you see any ill effects of legalizing marijuana on society?
Depends on how you define the phrase ill effect.
So there are gateway drug theories, for example.
Addiction risk.
Yeah.
I think the point of addiction risk is very valid. I think the gateway drug theory has now been thoroughly debunked. I've discussed that in the book, so I won't waste any time of the listeners. Suffice it to say that the gateway drug theory has been so thoroughly debunked that just saying that is good enough. There's no need to waste time on that. I don't think cannabis is a gateway drug. I don't think cannabis at any point of time was a gateway drug. I think the experiences of people who have consumed cannabis for a very long period of time, I have collected at least 2 survey reports where the surveyors questioned through a questionnaire people who had consumed cannabis for a span of over 10 to 15 years regularly. And the survey results are very interesting. The people who consumed cannabis for a period of 10 to 15 years regularly, these are surveys coming out of New Zealand and Canada and Australia, they had no criminal self-perception. People who are cultivating and consuming cannabis regularly for 10 to 15 years don't think they're criminals. People who are living with them, their spouses, their kids, their friends, they don't think that these people are criminals. And these people have been able to maintain steady relationships, steady jobs, they are paying their taxes, they are responsible and law-abiding members of their society, good people of their community, and the people, their neighbors don't have any problems with them. These are the survey findings of survey reports where all respondents are people who have consumed cannabis for over 10 to 15 years, and they have been doing this in the flying in the face of the law. The law declares the act to be criminal. The person who commits the act doesn't think they're criminal. People living with them don't think they're criminal. Nobody thinks they're criminal. At this point of time, I think the fundamental principle on the basis of which we have declared the law to be the addiction to be a crime, because in NDPS Act, consumption of cannabis is criminal. Cultivation of cannabis is criminal. Possession of cannabis is criminal. If you look at the capital punishment provisions of the NDPS Act, being in possession of, I think, about 500 grams of processed THC, extracted THC, is a capital offense. 500 grams or milligrams or some such amount, which we can confirm from the law. I think in my land, in my country, possession of THC, possession, cultivation and all these things of cannabis, etc., if they are attracting capital punishment, then I think we must have acted on a completely wrong understanding of what addiction could be. Our parliament couldn't have gone that wrong. Satvik, you'll be surprised to know that section 31A of the NDPS Act provides for capital punishment, death penalty for certain offences, and if you are and 20 kilograms of hashish or 500 grams of concentrated THC attracts capital punishment. So I think that's another important point that we should keep in mind. I think if nothing else, we should remove the provisions that call for capital punishment to be imposed in the case of cannabis, because we should notice that unlike opium, opioids, opiates, methamphetamines and all sides, these artificial drugs, the toxicity ratio of cannabis is extremely low. Nobody in the known history of the world has ever died of a THC overdose or a cannabis overdose. Of course, that's not to say that you should drive, etc. after consumption of cannabis. One should observe all those precautions that one would observe while consuming alcohol recreationally. But I think to come back to the question that you had put, I think the idea of criminalizing addiction, and I think the idea of declaring consumption of cannabis itself a crime, and the idea of declaring an addict themselves as a criminal, I think represents a very unenlightened, backward looking, now proven to be unworkable, now proven to be inhumane approach that our NDPS Act is still adhering to. And I think this work, that's very important. I think one of the key things that this work has pointed out is that you can't criminalize possession, you can't criminalize consumption. And in the case of I mean, if there is a case that a person has fallen an addict, for example in the case of opium, if somebody has become addicted to opium to such an extent that they are causing harm now, or they are at risk, they can be taken to a de-addiction center. But then you have to treat them the de-addiction has to be a process that doesn't treat the addict as a criminal, that doesn't treat the addict as a moral failure. But right now our approach is to treat the addict as if they have committed some great moral failure, and a sin from which they have to be redeemed, as it were. The modern day idea of addiction, which is based on behaviors, addiction is a behavior that people engage into essentially to soothe pain. And pain has diverse causes. Somebody could be in pain because of a physical ailment, another person could be in pain because of a psychological ailment. Body doesn't distinguish, the mind doesn't distinguish between the two types of pain. A person who is experiencing pain on account of, say for example, post-traumatic stress or depression, the body will understand that pain as the same pain which the body experiences on account of a physical affliction. And so therefore, if I'm referring to because that's the compound that has been isolated, but generally speaking, if THC heavy or THC dominant strains of cannabis are available, which can be taken by people and which result in their pain being diminished, then I think we should take a second look at the laws that we have. Because I believe if we declare a person consuming cannabis to be an addict, a criminal, somebody who has committed a great moral sin and who needs reformation, then I think we are making a grave error if we accept that in principle to be a good approach, a approach that can be followed. Then one day we could perhaps on the same principle treat a person who regularly needs insulin, a diabetic, also as a criminal. Because we can't say that a person who's consuming insulin regularly, a diabetic, the same reason why a diabetic can't be called a criminal is the same reason why a person who's consuming medicinal cannabis can't be called a criminal. And I think this is a very fundamental error in our law that we need to remove right now.
So Arnab was wrong about cannabis use.
Well, I'll leave that to Mr. Goswami.
All right. So there's also this sort of apprehension that legalizing cannabis will lead to increased use of cannabis, which would, I think, overall be bad for society, is the sort of popular claim.
The first question is exactly how is it going to be bad for society? That is to say, objectively, what will go wrong? Will there be an epidemic of crime? Will more people suddenly start committing violent crimes? Will there be a reduction in productivity of the youth? Those are very specific issues that have to be dealt with. But I think our apprehensions that if we legalize cannabis or if we decriminalize small quantities possession, then somehow consumption patterns are going to go up. I think that apprehension is not based out. That apprehension is not made out on the. What I think I'd like to say is that apprehension doesn't seem to be based on anything. The apprehension is not based on anything solid for the following reason. A, cannabis is widely available. If the position is that, let's say we decriminalize cannabis and we allow it to be sold commercially for recreational purposes even. So now cannabis is available on a liquor store. We have liquor stores across the nation. We can have a small segment, a small shelf there where producers can display their ganja and people can buy them. So let's say in a world like that, where things like that have come, or perhaps like the US, you can go online, you can show your identification certificates, whatever, and you can have it shipped to your house. Let's say hypothetically that India, that thing has happened in India. Will the consumption patterns suddenly go up? I don't think so. Because ganja is widely available now, cannabis is widely available, it is being consumed widely. The government's own numbers support that. I have run 3 surveys with my students, and our surveys support that. Vidhi and some other legal think tanks are doing work on this, and their research supports that. So where is the evidence that ganja, if it legalized, suddenly will result in increased consumption patterns? It is very valid to say that the teenage youth is exposed to it, and the teenage youth could get addicted to it, and there are health, there could be, like for example, driving under influence instances could be there, or people, that's very valid. Those are valid concerns. But experimentally, wherever this experiment was undertaken, that actually didn't happen on ground. So that's a good result for us. So people who have those concerns, their concerns are very well placed, but the international experience so far doesn't suggest that anything like that is likely to happen in India. Secondly, and most importantly, you see, in India, we have had a long historical connection with the plant. So the cannabis indica plant has been a part of Indian society and Indian culture for time immemorial. Also, the practice of consumption of bhang, which is consumed on, for instance, Holi festival, etc., that's legal in India. NDPS Act defines the cannabis indica plant in such a way that seeds and leaves of the plant, when separated from the flowering bud, are legal. And bhang shops, licensed bhang shops, are available for anybody who wants to look at them in entire UP. You can take a look at licensed bhang shops, and their bhang is available to be consumed there. So the restriction is really to ganja and charas. Now that restriction isn't also made out on anything scientific, because the psychoactive element in all these three is the same. There's delta 9 THC. So basically in India, delta 9 THC could be consumed by way of edibles recreationally, but it can't be smoked. That's a very strange position to be in. So I don't think the concerns that legalizing this is somehow bad for us. I don't think that concern is made out. I think somebody might try to use it for its rhetorical appeal, but actually it's not based out on any facts. And I personally, as a legal academic and as a person who advocates this, I am personally convinced that nothing of that sort is actually going to happen if this is legalized, because anywhere in the world it didn't happen. In societies that had literally no connection with cannabis, this didn't happen. We have had a historical connection going back thousands of years. Our society is more aware of this substance, this plant, is more familiar with it, and has been using it for instance, on the festival of Holi, etc. So Indian society has been familiar with the cannabis plant, and it has been familiar with this plant for more than like thousands of years. Not just for recreational purposes, for medicinal purposes, as well as for spiritual and ritual worship, etc. The fact that cannabis, bhang, especially ganja, is used for ritual worship is documented in the book, and it's also documented by Mr. Siddharth Luthra, senior advocate, in the preface of the book. So I do not dismiss the concerns of the critics, but I would like to reassure them that even though their concerns are theoretically well placed, practically they're not going to manifest in case cannabis is decriminalized or legalized in our country.
Is there something that I'm missing out, maybe, that you would like to talk about?
Well, off the top of my head, I think one thing that we haven't spoken about, that we should, is the whole criminal justice problem. There was a study conducted by Vidhi, which is a legal think tank in Bombay. That study I've discussed in my book. According to that study, an overwhelming proportion of charges that were brought in Bombay courts regarding cannabis under NDPS Act were cannabis possession charges, small quantity possession charges. In USA, it has been documented so overwhelmingly that there is almost no need to cite evidence now, but it is a fact that small quantities possession represented a nightmare for American criminal justice law enforcement. It presents the exact same nightmare for Indian criminal justice law enforcement, we have potentially exposed a lot of our youth to criminal charges in courts for offenses that are not required at all on our statute books. Consumption of cannabis is not creating any problems in our society. Cannabis has been, is, and will continue to be consumed in our country. NDPS Act's criminal prohibition didn't stop it, but what we have done in the process is that we have exposed innocent youth, college-going youth, some of them, talented youth. We have exposed the future of our country to unnecessary criminal charges. And I think that to my mind, as a lawyer and as a law professor, it's an abomination. We should not expose. The youth of the country has been experimenting with cannabis since this country existed. And I think the best way, the most effective way, the way most likely to succeed is the way where we go and educate the youth about possible risks of alcohol and tobacco like we do now. We educate the youth about possible risks of cannabis usage and leave it to their good discretion. Like I've said in the book, and I'll say again, a lot of people consume a lot of people consume beer in college and don't go on to become alcoholics. A lot of people consume cannabis and don't go on to become ganjedis, as it were. The taboo that is associated with ganja, that has to be broken completely. And I think in this country, we have to start educating our youth. We have to start making sure that the youth knows what they are doing and they experiment with it. If at all they wish to experiment with it, they go in with full knowledge. And I think I'd like to stop with that. I think there is another point that is often made by people who support cannabis decriminalization, etc., is the argument about police corruption. So police corruption and criminal justice are connected. Police is a part of the criminal justice system. The courts, the lawyers, the police, we all work together. The method in which we work together is different. Of course, as a criminal lawyer, if I'm engaged by a client, I'm duty bound to protect that client's interests, and the prosecutor is duty bound to prosecute them. The police officer is duty bound to collect evidence. The judge is duty bound to hear the case. But, and this was pointed out in the Lok Sabha debates also, that the manner in which the NDPS bill at that point of time is being drafted, it is liable to give huge discretionary powers to the police, and those discretionary powers are then liable to be abused. It is true of all cases of power. Any point of time discretionary power is given to any government official, some of it is liable to be abused. Why? Not because there is anything wrong with grant of discretionary power, but because human beings are different. Some people respond differently to power than others. I think that's another very serious problem that we need to remove. It was pointed out during the debates in Lok Sabha. It was very, very clearly stated, and I've discussed all that in chapter 5 of my book. And I think the potentialities where powers could be abused by any potential police officer in the case of cannabis and cannabis related offenses, I think that angle we have to take care of very carefully. And I think by decriminalizing small quantities possession, number one, and by removing from the NDPS Act the provision which says that consumption of cannabis itself is criminal. Please remember, in the entire world now, there are jurisdictions where consumption of cannabis is legal. So if an Indian citizen goes to Canada and consumes cannabis in Canada where it is legal, according to Indian law, the Indian citizen in India is still subject to Indian laws, by the way. So an Indian citizen in Canada is breaking Indian laws, is in violation of the NDPS Act because they have consumed cannabis. This is a very serious problem that we have to deal with. So we should remove the offense of consumption of cannabis from the NDPS Act. Consumption of cannabis can't be a crime. Possession of small quantities of possession can't be a crime. And furthermore, I think if we are progressive about it, we should have detailed cultivation policies, and according to those cultivation policies, cultivation of cannabis shouldn't even be a crime. I think that's the situation that we should aim our legal system, I mean, we should aim that we will put our legal system in this position, because if we do, we will simultaneously solve two problems. We will remove the criminal law exposure from our youth. Secondly, we will end up removing a lot of pending cases from the pipeline, and that will reduce the stress on our criminal justice system, the courts and the police. The police are overburdened. Sometimes an investigation officer has to investigate more than 40 to 50 cases at one point of time. Imagine yourself investigating 40 cases at one point of time. It is back-breaking work. We should be compassionate to our police also. They are also human beings. So they also need to be given much relief from this stress of pendency that they are constantly in. And our criminal justice system, the courts. The courts are also buried under these cases, and of course more is written about the court's pendency than the police pressure. I think we need to take efforts to reduce stress on our police and our criminal courts by removing from the ambit of what is considered a crime all these things that I mentioned: consumption, possession and cultivation. I think they should all be decriminalized, and this is an additional benefit to the police and to the courts that we didn't speak about, but I wanted to cover briefly.
Okay, so in chapter 2 of your book, and I quote, you say, "I'm gonna smoke the ganja until I go blind. You know, I smoke the ganja all the time." What did you mean by that?
Oh, it's right here. Oh, sorry.
The last one.
Oh, Bob Marley. Oh, Bob Marley is the... I've never actually heard any song by Bob Marley, to be honest.
I'm going to read.
No worries.